reviewing They Were Her Property, White Women as Slave Owners in the American South. Stephanie E. Jones Rogers. This book won the 2013 Lerner Scotts Prize for Best Doctoral Dissertation in U.S. Women's History. Wow. Um, she is an assistant professor of history at the University of California, Berkeley, and strikes into a very unique part of history because, as she says in the introduction, historians rarely differentiate married women who owned enslaved people in their own right and married women who merely lived in households which they engaged with, managed, benefited from the labor of enslaved people. Historians have neglected these women because their behaviors toward and relationship with their slaves do not conform with prevailing ideas about white women and slave mastery. They argue that women could not be true masters of slaves, rather, they were fictive masters. They did not relish the power, they did not view their activities as slave masteries, neither did Southern law or courts. This was especially true when it came to the violent forms of discipline. By extension, many of these scholars flatly reject the idea that white married women could adeptly manage enslaved people without the assistance of men. They were, be they white or black, or that side of fewer exceptional women, they could possess the acumen to do so while also effectively running plantations. Married women, they argue, begrudgingly assumed roles as deputy husbands and fictive widows when their husbands were away, which meant that white women were not a part, a functional part, or were mere beneficiaries of slavery, but they weren't active parts of it. And what this research actually goes into is explaining how white women were a huge part of slavery, even beyond the 13th Amendment. The process of how white women were engaged in slavery was through inheritance. White women were more likely to be given human property rather than land. And this was a very regular practice, and this was a practice from infancy. So you'll find that adult and child slaves were given to little girls either for company or caretakers. Adult women could be given to little girls. And it was part of the culture. And then when they got married, they were given slaves for turning 21, getting married, different occasions, Christmas, whatever. They were given. So these women accumulated quite a bit of wealth throughout their lives, and they carried that wealth with them in the form of slaves, which in turn made them more attractive on the marrying market, because a man that married a woman with this built-in wealth either created his wealth or expanded his wealth. Now, why is this important? Is this a way to just talk bad about white women today? No. What this is to point out how pervasive and deeply rooted slavery was in the fabric of the country. Which shows the relevance of the Civil War, which shows the systems that were maintained and attitudes that were maintained, even to this day, to protect the status quo. So many times when people say, I didn't do it, I didn't have any slaves, my relatives didn't have any slaves, can you honestly say that you're not the beneficiary of a system that was built on that process? And most of us have benefited as Americans from some form of inhumane treatment to one group of or another. And this particular book explains how both genders of the white community built wealth, passed wealth, and depended on a system of inhumane treatment, torture, abuse, sexual assault, mental abuse, for personal gain in perpetuity. People's families that have been politicians for however long, who have benefited from generational wealth, or just function under a protection of whiteness. When you go to court, when things occur, even though it doesn't occur the way you may want it to or not, it is not the question of, did this happen because I'm white? Whereas Native Americans have to worry about their race being an issue because of historical facts. Blacks, Latinos, Mexicans in particular, have those worries. Just like in the job market, because we have a country of misogyny, women may have to ask, is this happening because I'm female? And if we're being honest with ourselves, history functions that way. So this particular work is really talking about how history has misrepresented American slavery almost to an exclusivity of white male functioning. And there is a lot of evidence from court records, wills, newspapers, as to where white women not only owned slaves, but it was endorsed by the courts. It was recognized by the courts. Female ownership, because at that time, a lot of historians is automatically giving white women a pass because of what is that called? Where there is it's a policy where of called covering. And what they felt was that is where when you got married, your husband assumed power over the woman's assets. Well, this research illustrates how that is not as dominant a practice as historians have led people to believe. There were many women that retained their individuality and their wealth and passed it to their daughters and their daughters' children by way of human property. And this was an aspect of American history I had long suspected, but had no proof for. And I found it really interesting because there are many fallacies that in American history that kind of, in American society, that function differently around white women than it functions with anybody else. Like white women being recognized as a minority when they are the physical majority. There are more white women in this country than there is anybody else. But for the social outcome that's desired, the representation of reality is altered for that particular outcome.